They said the trouble in Rains County began with a fence line and a calf, but anyone who lived through that year swore the fuse was already lit, long before the first match. Rains County was new then, cut from the map in 1870, named for Emory Rains, its courthouse planted on high ground at a crossroads soon called Emory. Pines and oaks stitched the ridges. Dark creek bottoms fed the Sabine and Lake Fork. Roads were mostly ruts. People came with wagons and small dreams, a good crop, a milk cow, a safe roof. It started the way feuds always start, quietly. A smokehouse door splintered, a barn latch pried. 3 steers missing at daybreak. Someone set a hayrick alight beside a fence where 2 neighbors had argued over a boundary made of blazes on trees. Then a note appeared, stuck to a cabin door with a knife. "Leave this county, or you'll leave it under a sheet." Folks read it at breakfast and folded their hands over the words like they could hold them still. The sheriff did what a man could with more complaints than deputies. He rode the sandy lanes, swore in help, and wore his badge like a dare. But law in the 1870s fit only if a man let you slip it on. Cattlemen wanted the range open and the trails clear. Small farmers wanted fences to keep hooves out of corn. Each side swore the sheriff loved the other better, and every summons sounded like a provocation. Before long, nights in the bottoms were busy with hoofbeats and matches. They called it the Rains County War because it felt like one. Ambushes on dirt roads, arson that turned night red, masked riders tapping on shutters after midnight, and men shot off mules within earshot of their own kitchens. No bugles, no banners, just neighbors tying kerchiefs over their faces and calling themselves committees, defenders, or just plain right. A store roof went up with a whoomph, and the bell in town answered it, ringing wildfire along the road. Smoke lay over the fields like a sheet. The first killing might have been self-defense. The second had a witness who was kin to both men and couldn't decide which body to cry over. The third took place at a creek ford, a shooter behind a sweet gum, waiting for moonlight to touch water. People who could afford it sent their families to cousins in Wood or Hunt County. The poor stayed because they had nowhere to go and because a man can convince himself that trouble cannot cross a fence he hammered with his own hands. Into that heat came the circuit court. The judge rolled up behind tired horses, his docket thick with thefts and batteries that had names like grudges. The grand jury took the oath in a room where flies made a ceiling of sound and tried to decide how much of a man's story should be believed when his brother sat 2 benches down. They sent bills on a few soft cases, whiskey without a stamp, a saddle traded too cleverly. The hard ones, the killings, slid between words like water through brush. The sheriff slept in a chair beneath the courthouse window so he could hear hoofbeats. He rode alone at night, hoping his boot prints wouldn't advertise which cabin he had visited. One morning, shots cracked along the road, and a bullet worried a pale streak across his saddle horn. Folks said he laid his palm on that scar afterward the way a blacksmith checks a horseshoe, testing the heat so he wouldn't forget it. Preachers tried. They preached neighbor love to men who could quote chapter and verse and still carried a rifle to the amen. When a clapboard church burned, families met under the trees with a bucket of water and a thin resolve. The men answered the sermon with silence. The worst night, so people said for years, came with heat lightning and no wind. 3 cabins went up in a stagger across the bottoms, the riders moving like matches drawn on sand. Dogs howled, chickens thrashed in coops, and a child woke to a window full of orange. One man threw a quilt over his wife and shoved her through the door, then found the well rope burned through like a fuse. Another stepped onto his porch, fired twice toward the road, and heard a horse's iron answer, and then nothing. By morning, the bottoms were a procession of wet ashes and hollow frames. You can measure a feud by how people talk. Voices drop. Men stand farther apart to see hands. Children learn the names of creeks before the names of stars. When a stranger rides up, someone steps outside and sets a rifle within easy reach. Then, as suddenly as it had risen, the fever began to break. Not because of one arrest, not because a preacher found a verse sharp enough to cut pride, and not because a ranger's hat brim appeared under the eaves of the courthouse. It broke because ruin is expensive. Men woke to the arithmetic of ashes and admitted they were burning their own winter. Corn wanted mending. Fences wanted wire. Daughters wanted shoes. A county cannot keep a war going when the butter money turns to smoke. The riders who had boasted most loudly found themselves standing in cold kitchens, staring at empty hooks. A few tried to keep the pace, another barn, another warning, but their neighbors would no longer feed them or lie for them. It is hard to be bold when you are also hungry. There were trials later. A man took a plea on a theft he didn't commit, to avoid being named for a burning he swore he hadn't done. Another drifted west and wrote from Palo Pinto, "I am living." A widow moved above a store and took in sewing. If anyone asked whether the shirt she mended had been worn by a man who carried a torch, she used scissors as an answer and cut the thread in the air. The county healed like wood, slowly, from the inside out, leaving a hard seam you can still feel with the flat of your hand. The courthouse kept its minutes, thin pages in a schoolteacher's script, shrinking big events into small lines. Churches raised new roofs. Fields grew a crop that winter. Hogs put on weight, and children memorized sums that were not the tally of ruined things. But if a stranger asked too brightly about the old war, silence showed its teeth and someone changed the subject to weather. Years later, when the roads were more than ruts and the creeks had bridges, someone found a note in a trunk, 4 lines torn from a ledger in a tight hand. It named a night, a place, a party of men, and a cabin. No signatures, no faces, only proof that someone had once wanted the truth to live longer than breath. The widow who owned the trunk folded the paper and slid it under the shirts again. Memory, she decided, was the only court still open, and she was its clerk. The Rains County War did not end with a last battle so much as a last argument that trailed off into work. That is how most feuds end. The men who carried guns let their hands fall to shovels. The women who kept buckets near the door moved them back under the shelf. The sheriff took off his boots in his own kitchen and slept through the night. The county went on, sowing, reaping, marrying, burying, until the story thinned into a caution mothers told boys when they flared too quick, or a getting dark yarn men used to warn one another not to start what they could not stop. Stand in Rains County now, anywhere the pine gives over to pasture, and listen. You won't hear gunfire. You'll hear crows, insects, a truck on a far road, the 2-note call of a morning dove. But if the afternoon is still and the heat hangs just right, you might catch the memory of hooves in sand and a saddle creak close to your ear. You might think of a sheriff palming a scar in his saddle horn, of a preacher sifting nails from ash, of a widow cutting thread, and you might understand why the county does not care to speak the names from that year. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more true stories of the old frontier.